Hi, this is Rhett with TestingTheory.com, and today I want to talk to you about a 2,600-year-old A/B test, one of the first documented A/B tests ever, and this will be an introduction to A/B testing as we talk about who did this test, what it was, and why it's important strategically to understand so that you can do better A/B testing as well. A/B testing has been around for a long time, and the test I'm going to share with you today was done 2,600 years ago. This example I'm going to share with you is important because it shows good principles of how to do A/B testing, why A/B testing is important, and the value that A/B testing can bring to you and your organization. So you might be wondering, how am I going to share a documented record of a 2,600-year-old A/B test? Well, this example actually comes from the Bible, the book of Daniel. Now, whether you're religious or not, the value of this example is important because it shows some important strategies and principles that each of us as A/B testers need to do in order to have successful tests. So I'm going to share a little bit of the story behind this so you can see the context, just to make it more interesting. But I hope that you'll look for the principles of successful testing as we talk through this. Okay, so this comes from Daniel chapter 1 in the Bible, in the Old Testament. And the time is 600 BC. In Daniel chapter 1, it talks about how Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon, and he just went and besieged Jerusalem and pretty much destroyed them and took them captive, but he wanted to have some people that he could train up to be in his court. And so he went to the wealthy, to the wise, to the children of the kings, and he took them to train them so they could be future wise men in his court. So Nebuchadnezzar didn't want just any people in his court. He wanted people who had certain intellectual skills. In fact, it says this about them in the scripture. It says in verse 4 of Daniel chapter 1 that these people need to be skillful in wisdom, cunning in knowledge, understanding science, and have ability to be in the king's palace. So he didn't want just run-of-the-mill people. He wanted people who were intellectual and smart. And I love that because that's the value of the people who do A/B testing are like that too. They're using the science, they're smart, they're intellectual, they're using knowledge, and that's the type of person that will come up with a good A/B test. So these people are taken captive to Babylon. The king and his advisors decide who's going to be the children that will be raised up to be his future court wise men. And so they're in this group. And one of them his name is Daniel. And part of the plan that Nebuchadnezzar has is he's going to feed the children and teach the children and train them up. And as part of that deal, they get to eat the king's wine and the king's meat. But there was one of them named Daniel, and he decided that he didn't want to eat the king's wine and the king's meat. And so he got with the guy that was in charge. His name was Melzar. And he's like, hey, Melzar, I don't want to do this. But Melzar was afraid to change things. He was worried for himself. In fact, in verse 10, Melzar says this. He says, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. So Melzar was basically afraid to make a change. He didn't want to change the program. And as we do A/B testing, you may have worked with people like this. They're afraid to change things because they're worried. They're worried that things won't work out. Melzar felt the same. He didn't want to change the dietary routine because he was worried that it would be bad, that it wouldn't work out. So Daniel, being the wise guy that he is, he's smart, he proposes this solution. He basically proposes the A/B test. So in verse 12 of chapter 1, Daniel says this. He says, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. So Daniel says, let's prove it. Let's use data. Good testers and those who are wise use data to prove their point of view. And Daniel says, give us 10 days. This is important too, because why didn't Daniel say, hey, let's just see how we're doing after 1 day or 2 days? The 10 days is important. When you're doing an A/B test, you need to have sufficient data to get the results that you need. And it was the same in this case with Daniel. He didn't want to say, hey, let's test this for a day because there may not have been enough impact by that time period. So the 10 days is an important factor, and making sure you have the right time is important for running an A/B test as well. The other thing he said in verse 12 is that Daniel was going to eat pulse and water, which is different than the king's meat and the king's wine. And so the control group is the king's meat and king's wine, and variation 1 is pulse and water. And so any good A/B test will isolate variables, and we see Daniel doing just that. You've got a group of people that are eating the king's food, and you've got Daniel and his friends that are eating this variation, the different food. A good test will control for variables to help you know what is having the impact, good or bad. So now we have our time period, 10 days. We have our variations, the control and the variation with pulse and water, but then we need to know how to measure this test. And that's where we come to verse 13. Daniel says this, then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So Daniel's basically saying our primary metric, our goal, the thing that we're going to measure this by is the countenance. How do people look? And so if the people in the control group don't look as good as the people in the variation, then we'll know that the food was good and Daniel will have had success in his A/B test. So the measurement is the countenance. Every good A/B test has to have a clear outcome you're trying to measure towards. You have to have a primary metric. So to do good testing, you have to know what is success and when will we know that we've reached it. In the case of Daniel in this story, the countenance was the primary metric. So then the servant to the king, Melzar was his name, it says in verse 14, so he consented to them in this matter and proved them 10 days. The nice thing about running A/B tests is there will be people in your organization who will doubt the changes you're making, who will be afraid of doing worse if you make a change. But just like in this case, if you can prove it to them with data that it's a better solution, then you're more likely to get them to buy into what you're doing. A/B testing is the great equalizer. It helps people move forward with confidence, knowing that the decision they're making is good because they have data behind it, because they have proved it. So then we come to the conclusion of the test. In verse 15 it says, and at the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. So we see that the variation did better than the control, that the countenance, which was the primary metric, was fairer and fatter, looked better basically than those who were eating the king's meat. So we know which version won, but there's another lesson in the next verse, in verse 16. It says, thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink and gave them pulse. So basically, they implemented the change. Melzar knew which one was better, the pulse and the water, and the king's meat and wine wasn't as good. And so rather than just saying, okay, well, we got the results, we know what to do now, he actually implemented that change. He took away all the king's meat and king's wine and fed all the kids pulse. And that's what you do with your A/B test too. When you find a winning variation, you push that variation live, and it is now the new experience for everyone, so everyone gets that winning experience. So indeed, Daniel, who proposed this A/B test, was skillful in knowledge and wisdom. And that is the type of experience that you can have with your organizations as you do successful A/B testing. So again, just to summarize these principles, you want to make sure that you have a primary metric that you're targeting, that you're trying to improve. You want to make sure that you have clear variations that are challenging the control and isolating variables. You want to make sure that you have a good time period to run the test. You want to see that good trend so that 10 days later or 14 days later, whatever your period is, you know that that's the winner. And finally, you want to make sure you implement those winning changes. A/B testing is a way to be skillful with data, with science, to prove things, to prove the value of something, not just change it because someone likes it or someone thinks it's better, but to have actual proven data that something is better than something else. Thanks for joining me today for this quick example of this 2,600-year-old A/B test. A/B testing was good back then and it's still good now. And I hope that as you look at optimizing your businesses, you're using A/B testing as a key way to improve your conversion rates on your site. If you liked the video, go ahead and give me that thumbs up so I know you liked it. You can also visit me at testingtheory.com where I have other courses and information about successful A/B testing and a way that you can increase your conversions with every visitor that comes to your site.